Mrs. Sweet lived all her life in the countryside. Here she was born, studied, and married. Parents never spared a girl. There was one child in the family, so from morning to night she had to work. The economy was great. Mrs. Sweet never sat still. "Mrs. Sweet, you are messing around again!" Mother screamed. "Already are going." She sighed, but she thought, why did they give birth at all, to make it work like this? She tried to stay longer at school, to get some rest. Girlfriends were, but never walked with them. Mother did not let go. At home had to fetch water, feed all the animals, for heating the stove, and Mrs. Sweet did it all, when you went to bed. Hands and my feet were just humming. Finally the last bell rang at school. After graduation it was to take place. "Mother, I hope that at least there you will let me go look at the woman's daughter." "Certainly, how could it be otherwise?" unexpectedly kind Mother said. "Oplot," the girl asked modestly. "Now something will think." Went Mom to the closet. She took out her wedding dress, looked and put it on the table. You want to ruin it," not could believe. "You must be the most beautiful." She smiled. "Mommy, I love you." Rushed to her, a girl. Cold, leave these veiled tenderness. Women did not like hugs. Mrs. Sweet for a moment flashed through my head, that her mother still loves her. Mrs. Sweet was very pretty at graduation. Mother cut off and sewed a dress according to the figure of her daughter. She turned out very fashionable. "Hello," she heard the voice of a classmate. "Oops," Ralph scared turned girl. "I'm so scared," he did not understand. "Yes, no, just didn't expect," Mrs. Sweet laughed. "Let's dance," he gave her his hand. For some reason she was embarrassed. They went to the center of the room. Sounded like a nice slow track. Mrs. Sweet looked at Ralph. He was not handsome, but she did not consider herself. "Beautiful, you are beautiful." As if he read her mind. "You nothing too," said Mrs. Sweet, because something had to be said. "Why you haven't been dancing before?" he asked. "Once was busy at home," she shrugged. "It's clear," he nodded. "And this moment the music is over," they stopped. "Thank you?" "For what you said, girl." "You what?" Ralph laughed. "Just Mrs. Sweet could and did a lot, but I didn't know how to communicate with young people." "Let's go to, walk to the river," he called. "Let's go to." She looked around the room, understood that in general that is here and there is nothing to do. They left the school and went towards the river. On the street it was cool. Ralph took off his jacket, threw it on Mrs. Sweet on shoulders. They came to the water, stood, looked at the transparent surface and were silent. "Mrs. Sweet, what if I asked you to meet?" Would agree suddenly asked a question Guy. "A why not?" she originated on. "It was not visible." "Then I suggest." He stepped towards her, and I agree, she turned to him. "Fine," he took her by the hand. At dawn, young people sat on the shore. Was interesting. Boy told different stories. Nothing himself, as it turns out, we have fun in the village, she looked at him. To her, and you missed everything. He put his hand on her shoulder. She looked, but didn't remove it. Ralph, I have very strict parents, she looked at him. Nothing, I'm joining the army now, I'll be back, let's get married, he said and threw a stone into the water. She was silent. Mrs. Sweet wanted to enter the city, but didn't know how the mother would react. "Wait, you will," he turned. "Yes, I'm just about to quit," the girl nodded. "Fine," he moved closer. Home Mrs. Sweet returned in the morning, but strange as it may seem, Mother didn't say anything. "Mother, I want to go to town," the girl decided. "Talk about it right now." How is it all?" showed the woman around him. What did you think? That I will live with you all my life?" The girl stared at her. "No, but didn't know what to say, woman." "I already decided everything." "Adams." "Ralph back from the army, let's get married," she said. "What's more, Ralph?" Mother was horrified. "Classmate." Daughter looked at Mom, without raising her head. "When you all did it," the woman did not understand. "Today," the girl said softly. "Oops, Mrs. Sweet, look at me," shook her finger at her mother. "I'm watching," she answered and went to bed. There was some relief in the soul. What did she say about her studies, and about Ralph. She lay down on the bed and started imagining what kind of life they will have. Boy, she didn't like it at all, but not to be alone, she decided. What will happen to him in September? Mrs. Sweet went to the city to do it. This turned out to be easy. She became a culinary student. All students were provided with a hostel. Soon Ralph was sent to the army. Mrs. Sweet, let's do our thing, Margot said, roommate. What will we do? Mrs. Sweet asked her. We will cook pies and sell them on the street. What, no income? Margot looked at her. Yes, who will buy these pies from us? Mrs. Sweet was surprised. Here you will see, students, the same workers, will go and buy, especially if they turn out to be very tasty, then we will have regular customers. Margot looked enthusiastically. Well, let's still have nothing to do, Mrs. Sweet shrugged. The next morning the girls baked pies, went to study, and during the big break they went out into the street to sell what they made themselves. As Mrs. Sweet said, there were more than enough customers. All boys and girls, who went to change, wanted to have a bite, and the hot cakes were the best. On this day the girls have earned some, but they also had little concoction. But what, believed? Asked Margot. Mrs. Sweet. Yes, you were right, nodded her head. Young woman, tomorrow? Margot asked again. To her, Mrs. Sweet told her. Girls began a brisk trade. Sometimes they cooked so much that they thought they would just transfer the products. But how strange, everyone always bathed. Mrs. Sweet noticed that every day at the same time a young man comes up to her. He buys a lot of pies and it got me interested, and she decided to talk to him. Hello, she greeted him, when he came up the next day. Hello, you have very tasty cakes, he told her, looking straight into my eyes. Yes, I know, because we are taught to be cooks, and they just don't take it, smiled recruitment about a girl. Buying your pies, feeding all your kids, they are just happy, he smiled. You work as a boss somewhere? Dared to ask the girl. Yes, I have a small business, where I manage under my leadership for young people. They are so voracious that you can't believe it. Began laugh. I want to come to the breakfast hostel. In the morning I will bring you pies with the heat, suggested Mrs. Sweet. Fine, the man agreed. The next day he, as I had promised, approached the hostel. Mrs. Sweet gave him the most delicious, the most beautiful and hot fresh pies. Thank you to you, looked at her. This thank you, she smiled at him. Mrs. Sweet returned to the hostel. She was happy and fell in love. Margot looked at her. Dates, what do I have? Ralph, there is, I hid it between Mrs. Sweet's eyes. I know I am like that, who are waiting. Margot nodded her head. Her don't cut. Mrs. Sweet looked at her. Mrs. Sweet, here you are stupid, you can see, what a man with money. Since, while giving, girlfriend twisted her finger at the temple. I don't even know, just wanted to stop this topic. Girl, not as usual. Took pies to go, wrapped in a towel, so that they are hot for a change and go to school. Today the man didn't come, for something. The next morning, when Mrs. Sweet and Margot left the hostel, he was already there again. Girls, you will not believe, the guys ate your pies in one sitting. Looked at them. I will be your regular customer. You wear pies in the morning, and I will buy. Fine, they nodded. So went on for several weeks, but one morning, when Margot's Mrs. Sweet left the hostel, no man was there. But it's over. Phoebe looked Margot on Mrs. Sweet. Yes, okay, you, maybe, will come to dinner. Mrs. Sweet waved her hand. To her it was very sad that he didn't come, because the man has already managed to please her, but even at lunchtime he was not near the school. In the evening Mrs. Sweet was very sad. Not sadness, girlfriend, Margot approached her, I'm trying. Just somehow embarrassing. Walked, compliments, smiled, and then once and for all disappeared, she said sadly. Maybe something happened to him, Margot said. Not I know, maybe. Mrs. Sweet looked at her. She didn't want to talk about it. The next morning, when the girls came out, they saw him. Mrs. Sweet was so happy that even jumped from it. Hello, she approached him. Why were you not there yesterday? Asked him. Had to leave on an urgent business trip, he said. I hope you cooked pies for me, he looked questioningly. Certainly, look here, hot, fresh, beautiful, Mrs. Sweet showed him. Margot stood on the sidelines, and didn't want to disturb them. Man looked at Mrs. Sweet. What you do tonight, he asked her. Mrs. Sweet was proud. Nothing. So, maybe, we will meet, let's go somewhere, he asked. I don't even know. Mrs. Sweet turned to a friend. When you find out it was visible that a man flirts with her. Actually, I have a boyfriend, now he serves in the army, and I'm waiting for him, Mrs. Sweet told him capriciously. And it's nothing to worry about, without offering you anything, just meet and go somewhere, he recovered immediately. Fine income. She averted her eyes. Girls went to school. Man remained standing near the entrance to the hostel. Well, what did he say to you? Margot looked at her. Nothing special, Mrs. Sweet laughed. Not maybe. I saw, why did you talk about something for so long? Margot pouted her lips. He offered to come for me tonight, to go somewhere. Looking into her eyes, Mrs. Sweet. Girlfriend, I congratulate you, you got the most wonderful man in the city. Margot clapped her hands. What'd you say that how is Ralph? Mrs. Sweet did not understand. She been honest all my life, never cheated on anyone, so I don't understand now. How can you do that? But on the other side, two feelings fought in her. Ralph she never liked, and this man fell in love at first sight. She couldn't wait for the evening, and when, finally, he came, she put on a beautiful dress, which was her only, and walked out to the door. He was already there. Hello, she waved to him. Hello, he said. You know what I was thinking today? She asked. What was he interested in? We already seen so many times, you even managed to call me to meet, and we still don't know, like each other. Plant, she smiled. Why we don't know your name is Mrs. Sweet, your friend Margot, he answered. Where you know? She laughed. But you were talking to each other, here is what I remember, he just answered. What is your name? Asked Mrs. Sweet. Benjamin looked at her. Oops, what a beautiful name you have. Mrs. Sweet was very shy, but when you didn't take her hand, she didn't take it away. I want to invite you to the best restaurant in this city, he said. For some reason you look at me like that, she asked him. I am waiting your answer, he shrugged. I don't know what to say, she said. Maybe you have to agree, he suggested. She nodded her head. Here, this is the correct answer. Benjamin gave her an elbow, and together they walked along the sidewalk in the direction of the restaurant. Place, it was beautiful. I played soft music, and the waiters scurried back and forth. How nice it is here, said Mrs. Sweet. She looked around. Yes, I love coming here, he nodded his head. They made an order. Mrs. Sweet is very shy. A little sat talked. Where are you from? Benjamin asked her. I came from the village, long dreamed of studying in the city, the girl just answered. It's clear. What kind of young man are you? Man, everything was interesting. Ralph, my classmate, shrugged off Mrs. Sweet. What, you have a lot of love? Inquired about Vienna. I don't even know. He approached me for the first time at our prom, invited to dance. I did not refuse. After we started dating, I went to study, and he went to serve in the army. I promised to wait. Mrs. Sweet told the whole truth. It's clear, means love, the man nodded his head. Maybe, Mrs. Sweet shrugged. They looked at each other. Mrs. Sweet understood that she likes this man, and for his part he understood what he likes Mrs. Sweet. This moment Wayne started coming to Mrs. Sweet every evening. They walking and talking, and somehow they did not notice for themselves how we kissed for the first time. Oops, looked at him Mrs. Sweet after the kiss, what Benjamin didn't understand. I have never done this before, she said. How is Ralph? The young man did not understand. We just walking. Nothing more, he allowed himself. Confessed young woman. It's clear, nodded to Wayne. This kiss brought young people so close that they started dating. As soon Wayne offered Mrs. Sweet moved to him. Mrs. Sweet, don't do stupid things, don't lose this man, Margot told her. They just finished the first course, had to go on vacation. Mrs. Sweet nevertheless decided. She came to Benjamin and told him that first go home for the holidays, and then decide, move in or not. Young woman knew that Ralph must come from the army on vacation, and wanted to talk to him seriously. They dispersed to their villages. Mrs. Sweet came to my mother. Why did you not come to us for so long? As I didn't feel like meeting my parents. Mother ran up to her. Yes, no, what are you saying? Just there was a lot of study, and besides that, my girlfriend and I also worked part-time. The girls started talking. How where you were moonlighting? Surprised mother. Struggled, sold pies, some, but still income. For you managed to save so much money. What I bought myself and a fur coat for the winter, and boots. I also met a young man. Mrs. Sweet lowered her eyes. What kind of person be Ralph? There is mother surprised again. Yes, I know, Ralph is coming on vacation soon, so I'll talk to them. Young woman, I didn't want to tell my mother. I went to my room and went about my business there. Already started in the morning. Usually her work bring water to feed the animals and so on. Ralph arrived at the end of July. Mrs. Sweet, he shouted at the gate, when he came up. Hello? Ran out to him, but didn't hug. You are not happy to see me looked on her. Certainly work, but I need to talk to you, she told him seriously. Young people went to the river, there was their favorite place. They sat down. Well, I'm listening to you, Ralph looked at her. Ralph, it happened that I met another person. There was nothing with him. I told him that I have you, that I'm waiting for you. I know I decided to talk to you about it, Mrs. Sweet said, and she looked into the sand. All it's clear, I understand it happens. Nothing terrible. He touched her on the shoulder, got up and went to the forest. Mrs. Sweet understood that it hurt and hurt him, but she couldn't do anything. After this conversation, the girl stayed in the village for several more days, and then decided to go back to the city. When she arrived, then immediately went to Benjamin. Hello, she said. Hello? Hello? Looked at her vine. I spoke to Ralph, he understood everything. I know, it's really hard for him right now, but I couldn't do anything with myself. I like it, the girl spoke quickly. He smiled, hugged her. Hope, now you're moving in with me? He asked. Yes, certainly, nodded her head. From this moment young people began to live together. Margot was so happy for my friend, she came to visit them every day. By a few months Mrs. Sweet felt that she was pregnant. About this is what she announced to Benjamin that. That's why he got sad. What with you not work? She asked. No, why is the heat? He answered. So I need to do something, Mrs. Sweet said. For example, a surprised man. You don't want to Margot me, because I'm already pregnant? She asked him a question. He lowered his head and turned away from her. What Wayne happened she couldn't understand. Mrs. Sweet, I need to tell you something. He looked her straight in the eyes. What something happened she couldn't understand. Yes, I'm married. All this time my wife and I were in a quarrel, she went to her mother. I thought that everything would go to divorce, but recently she came back and said, that can't live without me. I was so worried about our parting, that now I am very happy to be reunited without raising your head, he said. This karma, said Mrs. Sweet. In what sense? I did not understand. Benjamin, and because of you I left Ralph. To him it was very painful and embarrassing. Now you are leaving me. Skills lowered her head and began to collect her things. Where you will go now? Asked Wayne. At first in a dormitory. How education will end. I will go back to my mother in the village, she confessed to him. Mrs. Sweet, if you need something, then you must contact me. What you will do with the child? Asked her. I don't even have options. This child will be born. She turned around and left his apartment. Margot sat in the room or became some kind of magazine, when Mrs. Sweet went there. Mrs. Sweet surprised. Margot, what are you? Surprised, calmly said the girl. What are you doing here? Margot did not understand. We with Benjamin broke up, she confessed. How broke you? Everything was fine. With you, girlfriend couldn't believe it. Here it turned out that he is married, they were in a quarrel, wife is back, and now they are fine, told Mrs. Sweet. All girlfriends. God, how I feel sorry for you. Hugged her. Yes, what else is this? Mrs. Sweet nodded her head. What else? Margot raised an eyebrow. I pregnant, friend spoke softly. Yes, what a wretch he is, how he could do that to you. Margot started screaming. What are you going to do? Nothing. I will finish my studies, timing allows it, and then I'll go to my mother. There's something there we'll decide, said Mrs. Sweet. They, with Margot on a new start, cook pies seldom near the hostel. So the years of study have flown by. Mrs. Sweet was already in her 6th month when they graduated. Neetu was to move to the countryside, but how to do that, the girl did not understand. She knew that her mother would not approve of her position. Mrs. Sweet got off the bus, went to her house. On she had a wide light dress, so there's nothing left unnoticed. Hello, said to her mother. Hello, passes, native, launched it with iodine. Mrs. Sweet entered, sat on a chair in the kitchen. Mother, I need to tell you something, she said. What, that you are getting married? Mother looked at her. No, not at all. Mrs. Sweet tilted her head. What? Well, then the woman did not understand. Do you remember, I told you about that man, whom I met in the city? She asked. Certainly, then nodded. She was scared. So here, we started living with him. When I found out that she is pregnant, it turned out that he is married. Mrs. Sweet spoke softly. It's a disgrace to the whole village. Something has done, Mother screamed at her. Well, what was I to do or go? Stay in the city, there I can't live. I will be one with a child. Here she came here, she said. Match their daughter's body on which the light stands. She just lowered her eyes and blamed her. Time went through life. But when Margot was in the hospital, had to give birth any day, and someone knocked on the window. She looked. It was Ralph. Ralph, she smiled. Hello, he waved to her. Where did you find out that I'm here? She asked him. Mother, yours told. You. Maybe now rejoice that they did the same to me, like me with you, she told him through the glass. City and Mrs. Sweet. I love you, said Ralph, smiled. What will you take? She pointed to his stomach. I'll take mine, will, Ralph nodded. Mrs. Sweet still understood that Ralph still didn't like it, but there was nothing to do. To not disgrace your mother to the whole village, you should have married him. Ivan was born late at night. This was such a relief and happiness for Mrs. Sweet that she couldn't put it into words. After a few days, Ralph took her out of the hospital, and they came to the village. Neighbors whispered, What, Ralph? I was on vacation in July, and she also gave birth in July. The deadlines did not meet, but the guy shut everyone up. No one dared to say anything. They began to live as a big family. Ralph grew up. When he was 3 years old, Mrs. Sweet announced to her husband that she is pregnant again. For it was very good news. He almost carried her in his arms and was very glad that he will have a child of his own. Certainly, he did not consider him his own, but there is still native blood. After the birth of their second child, they also had 3 and 4. All tried to help the mother with housework, but she didn't seem to see how they treated her, just got the kids to work. None of them did not hear from the mother an affectionate word. She drove everyone, and only Ralph indulged in every possible way. Other children saw that she treats him wrong, like everyone else. But Mrs. Sweet couldn't help herself. Already she loved her first child very much. Did everything for him. When the rest worked, she let him sit talk. One day, when Ralph was 15 years old, she took him to the kitchen and told him a story about his father. Mother, what are you saying? Ralph is not my dad, looked at her. Yes, he raised you, but your biological father is Benjamin, who lives in the city. Here is his data. If want, can you find him? Dropped a piece of paper on her son and looked at him. Can he asked? Certainly, Mother answered. Ralph just wanted to go to school, so he ran to the bus station, bought a ticket, and went to the city. Decided kill 2 birds with one stone, and go to college, and find your father. That and the other was very easy to do. In technical school, he entered the first time and came to the address, which break, he found his father there. Benjamin lived alone. Certainly, he was happy with the guy. They talked, he apologized and asked to convey his apologies to his mother. Here at Ralph there were no feelings. Father didn't have that much time. Ralph, it didn't matter at all. He went back to the village, told all mothers, it wasn't even surprised, that's how it all happened. After this, Ralph went to study in the city, the rest of the children stayed with their mother. Time went on, children grew up, some stayed here to work, on a collective farm, and some moved to a neighboring village. Mrs. Sweet with Ralph left alone. But here is Ralph, and life is lived, spoke Mrs. Sweet. You say something like that to your husband, we are still ahead. Yes, which one is ahead, we're not even retired. Somehow Ralph didn't come back from work. Mrs. Sweet worried, but then I thought, that lingered somewhere with the men, and went to sleep. At night she was awakened by a knock on the door. Neighbor said, and amp, quote, what's on the field? Ralph Harvester accidentally hit, and amp, quote, he was taken to the hospital, but they couldn't save him. How died? Looked at her Mrs. Sweet frightened eyes. Strong were damaged. Doctors couldn't do anything, the neighbor nodded. She had a telephone in the house, so they called her. Mother gathered her children. Not only Ralph was able to come. He graduated in radio engineering, he had a good mind. After that he was invited somewhere in a big city, continue learning, and from there they were taken abroad. And now he lives there with his family. My mother rarely came, usually only wrote to her. Other children were able to come, and a funeral took place. Everyone was very sad. Now Mrs. Sweet is left alone. Daughter, if you can, stay. And ask the brothers to stay too. Mother, you understand, what are you asking for? The impossible? Daughter looked at her. Why did you not understand that we all have families? We have no time, and you asked to stay with you, she told her. Fine, leave your mother here to die just like that, she sighed. What did you take, that your dying? Daughter was indignant. All parted ways, Mrs. Sweet left alone. She understood what was wrong with their children, but she couldn't help herself. Why must she always feel bad, and not to someone else? Gone 5 years. Mrs. Sweet, so it's okay. She dreamed that Ralph would come to her, but he never had. Danielle called on my daughter, though you come to me, why didn't you understand? That, so that you scold us again, but just ask the mother then. No, never. It's ringing to his Ivashka, let him ride. Hang up. While my mother would not be evil and strict, I still visited her. Am I sobbing woman alone? She went to bed at night. All of a sudden in the chest it became hot air, not enough. Mrs. Sweet, enough hands for everything, but I couldn't reach my phone. Then she took a heavy vase and threw it with force, which remained for some time, out the window. And at that moment a neighbor passed by. She, naturally, decided to come. Mrs. Sweet, what happened to you? She saw that woman writhing on the floor. Not waiting for an answer because soon they came, loaded Mrs. Sweet on a stretcher and taken away. A woman paralyzed. She was lying and staring at the ceiling, and couldn't do anything else. Neighbor phoned my daughter, telling her not to come, but to my mother. What with her? She asked the doctor. Stroke, and hence the paralysis. She can't survive 2 hits, answered the doctor's question. It's clear. How long will she be here? The woman was interested. Around months, this is exactly what the doctor set the time. How it goes there? Fine, nodded at Danielle. I went home, phoned the brothers. Need to was to decide who will take the mother. I cannot, I have a lot of work, small children, and also farms, the girl said. Think that my wife disagrees, one of the brothers said. And mine is of the same opinion, said 2. What then? The woman did not understand. House disabled people, someone suggested. Money where? Brothers looked at her. Let's call him. Well, why is he away? Younger brother suggested. Exactly, everyone agreed. They dialed the number, as usual there have never been. Then Danielle wrote him a message. He answered a few hours later that he is very busy. It's a pity Mom will not be able to come. Here it's a joke, she did everything for him, and he threw a phone sister. They took away their mother, decided that for several weeks they would live with each other. Certainly, in the families of relatives everyone was against it, but I just had to be patient and wait. How long are we going to endure this? Brothers looked at sister. Where I know me already got it all, she said evil to them. I have 3 small children, which I must follow, and here she is, wipe mine after her. At least your wife is doing this, yeah, and no exhaustion. Though what would be the legacy? And then we just waste power, brothers said. Listen, let's bring her home, let her lie there, and we will go to her every day in turn, Danielle suggested. It's a good idea, the brothers agreed. Already the next day Mrs. Sweet brought home. She could only move the fingers of her right hand, blink and move your lips a little. She lay and thought, that has become a burden to her children, that nothing can help them. They can't even die, but it just lies here, makes them do something. Maybe did not understand that the mother hears and understands everything, so everyone decided and spoke right in her presence. But whose turn is it today? Said younger brother Danielle. Another brother answered him. Yesterday it was my turn, today is mine again. Watched her on them. What, we are constantly moving. Maybe hire a nurse, suggested the sister. Yes, let's try. Neighbors, not much money will be taken in the village, but the care will be of high quality. Agreed, take with her. They went to your mother's neighbor, asked her if she wanted to be a babysitter for a small fee. And agreed. She followed Mrs. Sweet, small rubbed, a period shaft helm, sorry woman. She was so ashamed of her children that they couldn't do anything for the mother. But because she gave birth to them, raised to her feet, and that's what they do to her, left her alone in an empty house and don't even want to come visit. Neighbor didn't endure it for long, she went to Danielle. Danielle, aren't you ashamed after all? You can't do that to your own mother. She lies there alone. You think she is not bored? She does know everything, hears and understands. Oops, Mrs. Rogers, at least you don't get into it. We will decide, what should we do, what not. Once I refused to sit with your mother, the woman said, left the house and slammed the door. Danielle again dialed the number of brothers. She called them to her mother's house. What now we will do? She asked them. Let's take Mom to her favorite place, suggested by one of the brothers. You know, where she had her favorite place, near the river on the shore. There they met with our folder for the first time. Not getting to know each other, but just sitting, talking, another brother laughed. But who cares, now it doesn't matter anymore. They harnessed the horse, loaded into the sleigh mother. It was winter outside, but no one paid attention to it. They drive the horse forward. My neighbor saw on the way that they took Mrs. Sweet somewhere. She walked out the gate. Hey, where did you take your mother? She called to him. Maybe, at least they will take her to a nursing home, they said. Here, this is a good idea. There she will be much better, the woman praised the guys. Brothers led the horse by the reins, and the sister was sitting next to her mother. You forgive us, but we can't do this anymore, she told her, adjusting the handkerchief. Mother blinked. She understood, what were the kids thinking, but there was nothing I could do about it. From tears welled up in my eyes. But that arrived, they stopped the horse. To her, brother nodded his head. We leave? Asked two. Two, Danielle answered. The you attracting released? This ran back to the village. Bye, Mom, be happy with your father, waved the youngest. Woman wiggled her fingers. Goodbye, kissed her daughter. They returned to her house. Something you quickly came their neighbor. She saw through the window that the horse is running, and the cart is nowhere to be found. Where is the carty? Only then the woman. Everything came. She ran out of Mrs. Sweet's house, ran into her hut. There she threw on a short fur coat and ran to the river. Knew about the place Alara and Ralph. Only to be in time, just to be on time. Lamented for Valentine. Saw a cart from afar. Mrs. Sweet, a woman ran up, God bless, alive. She, by inviting Sonia, she somehow dragged them to the village, and then asked a neighbor to help carry the woman home. This is your walk, surprised neighbor. You let's an idea. Thank you. Escorted to him. Cold, until the man understands. It's raining, invested Mrs. Sweet in bed. Saw how bad I am. The children, meanwhile, found documents in her house. Everything had to be done. After among them was one, not like everything. Danielle, what the men asked for a testament, surprised then, what they didn't understand. Danielle read, what Benjamin leaves his house and apartment to Mrs. Sweet, and she can handle it, as he wants. What this means men did not understand. Running to the river, until she's there, and then all this Ivanushki expensive Ivanushki will get, shouted Danielle. They rushed off. Valentine saw it all from the window. She entered the house. Mrs. Sweet saw the papers, read. Now it's clear. Why are you so pissed off? Nodded at the head Larochka. Don't worry about anything. Ralph will come for you. She stroked her head. Those kids, who ran to the shore, were very surprised by the absence of Anya. They looked around and could not understand anything. Ivan arrived 3 months later. He took his mother. Apartment in the city they copied to Valentine, and decided to leave the house until better times. Mommy, I'll tell you about the best specialists. They will definitely put you on your feet, Van told her. She just stares and moves her fingers. We don't worry about it. I'll do everything, he promised her. They arrived in another country, where women began to study after 6 months. She could drink tea on her own, speech improved a bit, but Mrs. Sweet whispered indistinctly knew it wasn't enough. Woman asked her son to bury her in her native village, and next to his father, before that, she didn't go there.